the frozen mountains of North Korea, in November 1950, would witness one of the most extraordinary acts of military leadership in American history. Major General Oliver P. Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division, stood at the crossroads of obedience and survival, facing a decision that would either save or doom the 10,000 Marines under his command. The stage was set for catastrophe. General Douglas MacArthur's grand strategy called for a rapid advance to the Yalu River, the border with China, in what he believed would be the final push to end the Korean War before Christmas. Under this plan, Lieutenant General Edward Almond's, the 10th Corps, which included Smith's Marine Division, was to race north through the treacherous mountain terrain, splitting forces on both sides of the chosen reservoir in a dangerously exposed formation. But Smith saw what others refused to acknowledge. Intelligence reports spoke of massive Chinese forces crossing into North Korea. Yet MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo dismissed these warnings as exaggerated. The Supreme Commander was convinced that the Chinese wouldn't dare intervene in the conflict, calling it militarily impossible and politically suicidal. Smith knew better. A veteran of World War II Pacific campaigns, he had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded enemy action. Korean children, usually eager for American candy, had vanished from the villages. Wildlife was moving down from the ridges, displaced by something unseen. Most telling of all, the Chinese had left bridges intact over deep gorges, perfect for luring American forces into a trap. The tension between Smith and Ullman was palpable from their first meeting. Ullman, MacArthur's protege, had dismissed amphibious warfare as easy despite never having participated in such operations. He had condescendingly called Smith son, despite being only 10 months older. Their mutual distrust would prove to be the catalyst for one of the most crucial acts of military insubordination in American history. On November 1, 1950, Ullman issued explicit orders: divide the Marine Division, placing regiments on both the eastern and western shores of the chosen reservoir. Advance rapidly toward the Chinese border. Maintain an aggressive offensive posture. The plan looked impressive on paper, with arrows sweeping dramatically across the maps in MacArthur's headquarters. Smith studied the orders and made a decision that would define his legacy. He would not scatter his Marines across impossible terrain to satisfy the ambitions of distant commanders who had never seen the ground they were ordering men to die for. Instead of following orders, Smith made 4 critical decisions that would save thousands of lives. First, he consolidated his forces on the western side of the reservoir, keeping his Marines together as a unified fighting force, rather than dividing them into vulnerable, isolated units. The eastern shore would be left to an Army regimental combat team, a decision that would later prove tragically prescient. Second, Smith ordered his engineers to construct 2 airstrips, one at Hagari near the southern end of the reservoir, and another at Kotari further south. These weren't just landing strips, they were lifelines carved out of frozen mountain terrain by Marines working round the clock in sub-zero temperatures. When other commanders questioned the time and resources spent on these projects, Smith was adamant: we're going to need these before this is over. Third, anticipating that retreat might become necessary despite orders to advance, Smith established a series of fortified supply bases along the single mountain road leading back to the sea. Each base was positioned exactly 1 day's march from the next, stocked with ammunition, medical supplies, and food, and defended by carefully positioned artillery that could fire in any direction. Fourth, Smith deliberately slowed his advance, ignoring Ullman's increasingly frustrated demands for speed. While other units raced north to glory, Smith methodically prepared for the battle he knew was coming. He brought up the 1st Marines under Colonel Louis Chesty Puller to secure his supply lines. He positioned his artillery for maximum defensive coverage. He made sure every Marine knew the location of the nearest aid station, supply dump, and withdrawal route. The Chinese were watching, and they were planning something massive. General Peng Dehuai, commanding Chinese forces in Korea, had already told his subordinates, "We will employ a strategy of luring the enemy forces into our internal line and wiping them out one by one." The chosen reservoir was to be the killing ground where American forces would be trapped and annihilated. On the night of November 27th to 28th, 1950, the trap was sprung. Over 120,000 Chinese soldiers launched coordinated attacks against the scattered UN forces around the reservoir. The temperature plummeted to -35°F, cold enough to freeze weapons, blood plasma, and expose skin within minutes. The Chinese came in human waves, blowing bugles and screaming battle cries. overwhelming forward positions through sheer numbers and savage determination. The Army regiment on the eastern shore of the reservoir was decimated within hours. Cut off from support and facing overwhelming odds, Task Force Faith fought desperately, but was eventually overrun. Of the 3,200 soldiers who had occupied the eastern positions, fewer than 1,000 would make it back to friendly lines. The unit essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. But on the western shore, Smith's consolidated Marines held firm. The two airstrips that other commanders had dismissed as unnecessary became the keys to survival. Transport planes braved enemy fire and impossible weather to land on the frozen runways, bringing in ammunition and medical supplies, while evacuating wounded. In 5 days, over 4,300 casualties would be flown out of Hagari, men who would have died without Smith's foresight. The Chinese threw everything they had at the Marine positions. Entire divisions attacked night after night, accepting horrific casualties in attempts to break through the American perimeter. But Smith's careful positioning of his forces created interlocking fields of fire that turned each Chinese assault into a killing field. Marine artillery, mortar, and machine guns operated in perfect coordination, cutting down wave after wave of attackers. When Chinese forces managed to cut the road behind the Marines, trapping them in what appeared to be an inescapable pocket, Smith refused to panic. This was exactly what he had prepared for. His supply bases along the mountain road became strongpoints for the fighting withdrawal. His consolidated forces could concentrate their firepower against enemy roadblocks. His airstrips kept the Marines supplied and gave them hope when hope, it seemed, impossible. The withdrawal from Chosin became a fighting retreat that defied every prediction of disaster. When reporters asked Smith if his Marines were retreating, he delivered the line that would echo through Marine Corps history: "Retreat, hell. We're not retreating, we're just advancing in a different direction." For 13 days and 7 miles, the Marines fought their way south through a frozen hell of Chinese ambushes, roadblocks, and human wave attacks. The temperature never rose above zero. Men's feet froze solid in their boots. Weapons had to be kept warm with body heat to function. The wounded rode on trucks through blizzards, their blood freezing before corpsmen could treat their injuries. But they kept fighting. At Funchalen Pass, Chinese forces destroyed a crucial bridge, creating what seemed like an impossible obstacle for the Marine column. Smith's response was characteristically methodical. He had bridge sections airlifted from Japan and parachuted into the mountains, where Marine engineers assembled them under fire and restored the route south at Toktong Pass. A single Marine company held a critical position against an entire Chinese regiment. Captain William Barber and his 254 men of Fox Company fought off attacks by over 1,000 Chinese soldiers, maintaining their position despite being surrounded and cut off. When rescue arrived, only 80 Marines were still able to fight, but they had kept the pass open for the withdrawal of thousands of their comrades. The Chinese paid a terrible price for their failed trap. Of the 120,000 soldiers committed to the Chosin offensive, over 60,000 became casualties, many frozen to death in the mountain cold. One entire Chinese division, equipped for tropical warfare, was virtually wiped out by the weather alone. Their bodies found wearing canvas shoes and light jackets, inadequate for the Korean winter. When the Marines finally reached the port of Hungnam on December 11th, they had accomplished something that military analysts still consider miraculous. Of the 10,000 Marines who had entered the Chosin Reservoir pocket, over 14,000 emerged. The higher number included attached army units, Navy personnel, and even some South Korean soldiers who had been integrated into the Marine column during the withdrawal. The Chinese had intended to destroy the 1st Marine Division. Instead, they had faced a perfectly executed withdrawal that preserved not only American lives, but American honor. The Marines had brought out their wounded, their dead, and most of their equipment. They had inflicted casualties on the enemy at a ratio of nearly 6-to-1. They had turned a strategic disaster into a tactical masterpiece. Back in Tokyo, MacArthur's headquarters was stunned. The Supreme Commander had promised victory by Christmas, but instead found himself facing a massive Chinese intervention that would transform the Korean War from a police action into a bloody stalemate, lasting 3 more years. The rapid advance to the Yalu had been stopped cold by an enemy that MacArthur had insisted would never fight: Almond, whose aggressive tactics had contributed to the disaster on the eastern shore of Chosin. Privately blamed Smith for being too cautious, but even he couldn't argue with results. Smith had saved not only his own Marines, but the entire X-Corps from complete destruction. Without the Marine withdrawal to cover them, the Army units retreating from other positions might have been annihilated. The immediate aftermath of Chosin revealed the full extent of Smith's wisdom. The Army regiment that had replaced his Marines on the eastern shore suffered over 80% casualties. Units that had followed Armand's orders for rapid advance found themselves cut off and destroyed. Only those commanders who had, like Smith, prepared for the worst-case scenario managed to extract their forces intact. Smith's decisions at Chosin became textbook examples of military leadership under impossible circumstances. His willingness to disobey orders that he knew would result in unnecessary casualties was studied at military academies around the world. His methodical preparation for contingencies became a model for how commanders should plan for operations in uncertain environments. But the personal cost to Smith was significant. His relationship with Armand never recovered from their disagreements during the campaign. MacArthur's headquarters marked him as an officer who couldn't be trusted to follow orders without question. While Smith was promoted and eventually became Commandant of the Marine Corps, he was always viewed with suspicion by Army commanders who saw his independent thinking as a threat to military discipline. The Marines who served under Smith at Chosin never forgot what he had done for them. Years later, at reunions and ceremonies, aging veterans would speak with tears in their eyes about the general who had refused to sacrifice their lives for political expediency. They understood that Smith had risked his career to save their lives, and they never let anyone forget it. Smith himself rarely spoke publicly about his decisions at Chosin. When asked by historians why he had disobeyed orders, he would simply say, "I had 10,000 Marines depending on me to get them home. That was more important than following orders that would have gotten them killed." His humility masked the extraordinary moral courage required to make such decisions under extreme pressure. The strategic implications of Smith's actions extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. By preserving the 1st Marine Division as an effective fighting force, he maintained American credibility in the Korean conflict. The successful withdrawal from Chosin demonstrated that American forces, while surprised by Chinese intervention, were not defeated. This psychological factor proved crucial in maintaining Allied support for continued operations in Korea. The Chinese, despite their tactical success in springing the trap at Chosin, learned that American forces, led by competent commanders, were extremely difficult to destroy. The heavy casualties suffered by Chinese forces in their attacks on Marine positions forced them to reconsider their tactics for the remainder of the war. They had expected to face demoralized troops in headlong retreat. Instead, they encountered disciplined soldiers conducting a fighting withdrawal that made every mile cost them dearly. The broader lessons of Chosin resonated throughout the military establishment. The importance of maintaining unit cohesion, the value of thorough preparation, and the necessity of contingency planning all became emphasized in military education. Smith's examples showed that true leadership sometimes required the courage to say no to superiors when their orders conflicted with the welfare of subordinates. The technological aspects of Smith's preparations also influenced future military operations. His insistence on constructing airfields in forward positions demonstrated the crucial role of air mobility in modern warfare. The ability to supply forces and evacuate casualties by air, even under combat conditions, became a standard consideration in military planning. The medical lessons learned at Chosin were equally significant. The Marines' ability to evacuate wounded from the battlefield airstrips resulted in survival rates that would have been impossible in previous conflicts. The development of cold weather medical techniques, field hospitals, and air medical evacuation procedures saved thousands of lives and influenced military medicine for decades. Smith's leadership style became a subject of extensive study in military leadership courses. His combination of strategic thinking, tactical flexibility, and genuine care for his subordinates represented an ideal that many officers strived to emulate. His willingness to accept responsibility for difficult decisions, even when those decisions contradicted higher authority, demonstrated the moral courage that true leadership requires. The international implications of the Chosin campaign also shaped Cold War strategy. The successful American withdrawal, despite Chinese numerical superiority, demonstrated that Western forces could hold their own against communist armies. This had important effects on NATO planning and the overall balance of deterrence during the Cold War period. In the decades following Korea, Smith continued to influence military thinking through his writings and speeches. He emphasized the importance of understanding both the capabilities and limitations of military force, the necessity of realistic planning based on actual conditions rather than wishful thinking. and the fundamental responsibility of commanders to their subordinates. The legacy of Smith's actions at Chosin extended beyond military circles. His example of principled leadership under pressure became a case study in business schools, government programs, and leadership development courses. The core principles he demonstrated, putting people before politics, preparation over wishful thinking, and moral courage over careerism, proved relevant in many non-military contexts. When Smith died in 1977, his funeral was attended by hundreds of Marines who had served under him at Chosin. Their presence testified to the enduring bond between a commander who had refused to waste their lives and the men whose lives he had saved. The inscription on his gravestone read simply, "He brought them all back," a tribute that meant more to him than any medal or promotion. The Chinese commanders who had planned the Chosin trap later acknowledged Smith's tactical brilliance in their own military histories. General Peng Dehuai, writing after the war, admitted that the Marines' withdrawal had been a masterpiece of military art that had turned certain victory into costly stalemate. Even enemy commanders recognized that they had faced an exceptional leader. Modern military historians continue to study the Chosin campaign as an example of leadership under extreme adversity. Smith's decisions are analyzed not just for their tactical merit, but for the moral courage they represented. In an age when military and political leaders often prioritize public relations over public service, Smith's example stands as a reminder of what true leadership looks like. The story of Major General Oliver P. Smith and the Battle of Chosin Reservoir remains one of the most powerful examples of military leadership in American history. It demonstrates that sometimes the greatest service a commander can provide is the courage to disobey orders that would needlessly sacrifice the lives of those under his command. Smith's willingness to risk his career to save his Marines exemplifies the finest traditions of American military leadership. In the end, Smith's legacy is not just about one battle or one campaign, but about the fundamental principles of leadership that transcend time and circumstance. His example shows that true leadership requires moral courage, that preparation and prudence can overcome superior numbers, and that the greatest victory is not conquering an enemy, but bringing your people home safely. These lessons, learned in the frozen mountains of North Korea, continue to inspire leaders in all walks of life who face the challenge of doing what is right rather than what is expedient. The captain who scrapped MacArthur's plan and saved 10,000 Marines on the bloodiest night proved that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the courage to disobey, and that the finest memorial to a leader is not in stone or bronze, but in the lives of those who lived because someone cared enough to risk everything for their sake.